And so it is that we come to the last of these 4 sermons that we have been focused upon this month. They came out of an experience years ago with a pastor in Louisville, Kentucky, who received word that his young daughter, 8-year-old daughter, had been diagnosed with leukemia. And he walked through this series very publicly with his congregation as he went through the process of her deterioration and the learnings that he was able to glean from the process. Today, as we close this series, I couldn't think of any other way to phrase kind of a culmination of what's been said and where we may be as individuals on our journey. That grief it's a messy thing. It's a hard experience. It's difficult and it's complex and it isn't easy. We live in a death-denying society, you know. If I, on one of my days off, happen to settle into watching some mindless group of shows that I've seen before, my wife's glad that finally NCIS is no longer run back-to-back every day of the week. If I settle in, I almost get to the panic stage because there are all these things advertised that can fix me. Things about which I need to explain to my doctor I need. And so it worries me because I might be dying and not know that I need that medicine. Everyone is trying to sell me something that would enhance my health or the odds of living longer. And on top of that, if it's not something that has to do with the internal physiology and the problems of illness, it's those things that would help me look as if I'm not old. There's an abundance of those things. And so we just live in this place that's market-driven that helps us deny the fact, I'm sorry, I know you came for an uplifting worship experience, but we're all going to die. There, I've said it. Not only that, but along the way, we find ourselves reflecting upon how connected we may be in our journey to that great not yet. Oh, wow. You know what? We are the most connected, least connected society that perhaps this country's ever seen. I wish I had brought my phone in here. I could have showed you. I must have 4,000 friends on Facebook. See how many friends I have? Not that I've ever met many of them, but I've got all those friends that I'm sure I can bank on. When in truth, most of us know that the number of friends we really can journey with and count on are few in numbers, and the sad part is for many of us, they become fewer each year that we journey. When we read the story of Job, it's some kind of story. That's why I just had to pick bits and pieces to go through because, there's a whole series of sermons in Job, but I just wanted to focus on these pieces as we move through. Job had just 3 friends. And whoa, that was way more than enough. Because they managed to certainly complicate his life and make life as miserable as one could possibly experience in the midst of disaster. You know the story of Job. I grew up with Sunday school teachers and people talking about the patience of Job, but if you read the whole of Job, Job wasn't so patient. He was like any of us would be if we were caught up in this great experience of misery. He agonized through the process. He watched his family taken away. He watched his resources taken away. He experienced the worst as he watched his health taken away. I can't even imagine what that must have been like for Job. The storyteller says that Job had it all. And he lost it all. Why? Because of some kind of great philosophical discussion between God and Satan. Now, as I preach this sermon, I'm going to preach this sermon what I believe we were meant to glean from the story. But if you want to have a private conversation with me in terms of what I think about the story of Job, well, you may not want to hear that. It's a fascinating story. Here is a man, there's a conversation, and because there's a conversation, he loses everything. I had a professor of the Old Testament years ago who believed that this was an expression, a late expression of the people of Judah trying to decide why it was that so much pain and so much suffering had come upon the people of God. And it could be that. It could be a corporate wrestling with why this has happened to us. But it's told about the story with one person, Job. It's interesting because we come to these stories of misery and pain and sorrow, and some of us pull back. And so Job, it was not on my list of things that were read to me at bedtime when we had in my family, we had, every night you had to have some scripture read to you. It's kind of like, bad tasting cough medicine. My mom thought it was good for you, no matter what you may have thought. Job was never on that. Because I think Mom did not want us to have to engage the conversation about suffering and pain, that we would be shielded from that conversation. And today I think that has grown even more intense as families do not want to expose their children to the negative parts of life, the pain, the suffering, the grieving. But here's the thing. They will be. And they are. Grieving starts early in life, and there's nothing parents can do to change it. Best friends get accidentally moved to another school because somebody arbitrarily draws a boundary down the line. And suddenly, this best friend and this best friend lose touch. And there's such grief and frustration, even as they have to find a way to move on with new friends. That's grieving. That's loss that takes place. For some kids, in my case, it was experiencing grief initially through beagles. And I don't mean Snoopy. I mean that living up on the mountain for as long as I can remember, we had beagles. My dad loved beagles, and they were the best pets. And the mountain's the place for them because they love to run and hunt. But we didn't have beagles that were house dogs. We had beagles that were outdoors. And when the winter got cold, the basement door was always open. They could go into a warmer place. But by and large, they were out there, which meant that they came and they went. Many tears were shed over those beloved pets. There's an old story from the movie The Big Lebowski, where the old storyteller says, well, some days you eat the bar and some days the bar eats you. Well, that's how nature is. And so the beagles were loved, cared for, but they also sometimes were lost. So early on, I grieved. Also, because of the time I grew up and the place I grew up, it was hard to deny death because the first grandparent that I lost in my remembrance was my paternal grandfather. And this may really seem strange now, given how we kind of push death aside and try not to notice it. But the body was laid in rest in front of the fireplace in our living room. I didn't sleep in the house that night, by the way. I thought that was creepy even for the culture I grew up in. But you see, grief was there. And then my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, the one I loved the most, died while I was in college, and I grieved. All along the way, life introduces grief into our experiences, and we have to walk through that. Later, of course, and I've talked about this in this place before, it was walking through 19 years of marriage and then being told by your spouse that she wants out, and you go through the divorce. Now, the divorce is a different kind of grief, it's been said, because divorce is when you experience almost a death, but you keep bumping into the corpse along the way. Life is full of sorrows, not like Job, but full of sorrows. Job had it all, and suddenly he didn't. You sit down and read the book, and you find different stages that Job experienced along the way in his grief process. He didn't even have modern books to tell him what stages he should pass through. And the writer who's telling the story seemed to have great wisdom in talking about how this experience was worked out. Initially, the three friends came and they sat with Job on the dung heap. They didn't open their mouths for a week, and trust me, that was going well. They didn't open their mouths for a week. They sat with Job in his misery. There are losses that are so deep and so difficult in our lives that we move into a place of numbness. We just become numb. And it must have been that way for Job. He just sat there, overwhelmed by his losses, overwhelmed by the pain. The body is a gift that way, because when we experience loss, the body moves into another place. The metabolism changes, and we, at least our bodies, are trying to carry us through those moments, through that numbness, through that pain. Gradually, though, Job realizes that his family and his fortune and his future appear to be gone. And so you move past that numbness into some place of, this has really happened to me. I've really lost everything. And at one point, he even longs that his life would end, or that he had never been born. He never curses God like his wife says for him to do, but he does curse the day he was born. And then he moves on into a place of memories. He remembers how good it was. You may have picked up on the reading when DJ took us through there. He remembers how great life was before all this happened. The good memories. And that's what happens for us in grief oftentimes. We go back and we move into this nostalgic place, which is pretty much the problem of the church forever. That we grab those memories and we hug them and hold on to them, and we think, well, we can live back then. We can claim that space. And we can stay in that space, and maybe the world won't notice as it goes by. There's a problem with that, isn't there? The problem is that you can't just live in the past. And holding on to those nostalgic memories as a place to live, it might give comfort. But those past memories aren't the basis for building a life in the future. I've mentioned this, but when I was in the Great Dismal Swamp and pastored 3 little churches there in northeastern North Carolina, in the middle church there was this family lived next door. Actually, it was a woman and her daughter. The woman who owned the place was quite old. And her daughter had been living there with her even before the daughter's husband died. But he died He was probably in his 50s. And I would go visit this, and it was like literally caught up in a Southern Gothic novel. The truck he drove had been kept tuned and filled up with gas, always set under the shed next door. Periodically, his clothes were taken out and washed and pressed and put back in the door. Every night at the dinner table, because they invited me to dinner one night, and I only counted 3. There were 4 places set. They could not move on because they needed to live in that past space. And for years, they'd been living in that particular way. Mother, daughter, waiting for the son-in-law, husband to come back. You can't stay in the past forever, even though it's painful to work and walk through the grief. Eventually, Job chose the future. But he found in looking to the future, it was a place of anger. He had to face the fact that he had lost everything and somebody must be responsible for it. And that's when the comforters decided they were going to open their mouths and provide comfort. And how did they provide comfort? You did it. You did it. It's your fault. You must have sinned. Why would God treat you this way if you hadn't sinned? Job says, no, I haven't done anything to merit this. I've always been faithful to God. You must have. This is where we get that conversation with the Deuteronomic theology. If you're good, God will bless you. If you're bad, God will get you. We talked about that the last couple of weeks. So we got mad. Somebody must be to blame. And sometimes that's what happens to us in the process. We get really angry. We could take a lesson from those comforters. Giving pious utterances, pious platitudes to people in pain, it's just the worst thing we could do. What they need for us to be there, to open our hearts and open our ears and just to be there. They don't want you to theologize about why this has happened to them. They don't want you to tell them what the will of God is. They don't need amateur theologians trying to explain all the evil in the universe. What they need is they need a friend who can love them and accept them and be with them in that moment of pain. The calamities of life are mysterious. It's not for us to explain them away for people or intellectualize them with quotes from some chicken soup from the soul book. The friends made things worse and added to the anger. And then eventually 2 things happen. 1, God finally countered Job's cries. Moved past the justice-injustice approach to the mystery and begin reminding Job of the same reality that we talked about last week in terms of life. And that is everything Job had in his life, everything he held precious, everybody he truly loved, they were all gifts. Unearned gifts, pure grace. Gratitude and humility eventually become part, hopefully when we walk through these processes, that we can claim with gratitude the love that we experienced, the time we had, the love that we shared. Out of the whirlwind, God spoke. Job heard apparently what maybe Job needed to hear. Nothing really belongs to us when you get right down to it. God also reminded Job that meaning could be found in life once again because God had the capability of giving it. No one moves beyond grief unless they have hope. Myron Madden once said, "The essence of despair is relegating God solely to the past." What is nostalgia, if not fear that God can't do as well in the future as God's done in the past? When we grieve and we fail to move forward, then we create idols of those whom we love. We say to ourselves, if we can't have this gift our way, we don't want anything at all. And we fail to trust the creativity of God. The experience of grief can harden people, embitter people. I've seen it. I know it. It can isolate people. But if we're willing in our grieving, if we are willing to experience and enter and lean into the grief, the process itself can widen us, deepen us, to receive gifts we may not know that we've had before. We can become more grateful for the gifts we've been given, more open-handed in handling relationship and events in life. So when we read Job and we ponder the future, perhaps it's time to move into that future. Corporately, I speak from the experience of having pastored multiple churches in lots of different contexts and places. The grief of it no longer being 1952 is incredible. I remember when Pastor so-and-so was here. We had people hanging out the windows. I remember when we had a 100-voice choir, and actually most churches never had more than 20, but it always had a 100-voice choir. I remember when worship was thrilling. I remember, and I always want to say, but what do you anticipate from God in the moments to come? That's always the question, both in terms of how we live life, the losses we experience, the pain that we feel. It's not to trivialize any of that. It's just that God is always, even with our pain and even with our grief, calling us to the next place along the way. Boy, that wilderness looked pretty bad once the people of Israel got out of Egypt's bondage. Man, the garlic, all the good stuff we had to eat in Egypt, never mind that we were slaves and had nowhere to go and no way to really do anything but make bricks and build. That was pretty good, because out here in the wilderness, we may have our freedom, but the eating's pretty scarce and the water's hard to find, and we want to go back there. But we really don't. We can only move forward because that's where the hope is. Relationally, with those in our families, with our friends, with our communities. We can only live forward in giving thanks for what God has given us in the past and saying yes to what God will give us into the future. Walking through grief isn't easy. I will close with this. Last night I snuck away before the concert was over, and it was a beautiful concert for those of you unable to get out, because I had a little crisis. My younger sister called, and she's grieving so intensely the loss of her husband. And it seems like everyone in her community are like Job's friends. She just needed for me to get in the car, Bluetooth turned on, and pretty much listen to her tell her stories and cry, all the way back over to Merritt Island. And I listened. I know she will find a way forward because I know in her heart she has faith that there is a future. But for now, she's in this place. Do you know people in your life who may dwell in that place? And they need an arm around them, the touch of her hand. Well, you know, Florida's a little bit southern, but not quite as much as the other part of the South. Maybe a pie cooked. I don't know. That's what they do, where I grew up. Just to let people know, not that you have the answers, but you'll share the love. God help us to be willing to be with each other in pain, that hope may prevail.